So thanks for staying for the second half. And this is part of, this talk is part of Buddhist Action Month. I prefer to call it that than the abbreviated version, BAM, because it sounds like either a cleaning product or someone hitting you in the head. But it's part of Buddhist Action Month, and which usually it started in the UK and has been running in different parts of our community worldwide for a few years now. The title of this talk is Taking the Climate Crisis Onto the Path. And I've called it that for two reasons. First, it's not always apparent, I guess, to some people who are practicing Buddhists that climate change has much to do with the Buddhist path, which is, after all, the path of liberation of consciousness. So I'm hoping to explore the relationship between those two things and to see why I think there are very strong connections indeed. And secondly, there's a practice in the, I guess, the Vajrayana tradition known as taking obstacles onto the path. This is the practice of taking life's difficulties as the basis for practice. This comes up in the third point of Atisha's 7-point mind training, but also in spirit, I think you could say. It comes up in the 8 verses for training the mind by Langri Tangpa, and another longer text called the Bodhicharyavatara by Shantideva. And part of that text forms the 7-fold puja that we do here. So this idea of seeing life's difficulties, things that you find stressful, things that tend to provoke an ego reaction of some kind, as opportunities for practice. So the specific term comes up in the 7-point mind training, and the phrase is something like this, depending on the translation: when all the world is filled with evils, place all setbacks onto the path of liberation. This doesn't mean, by the way, wallowing in difficulties and obstacles or actively searching them out for their own sake, simply that life inevitably gives us a degree of suffering and that we need to work head on with this when it comes up. It means seeing difficulties as valued opportunities to see into our own egoistic reactivity in order to become free, and also in order to help others to become free as well. Quite a task. And without a doubt, climate change is something that is already starting to bring about suffering, and is going to bring a great deal more unless it's both urgently and comprehensively addressed. So I'm sort of here to say, here is something that is coming up. We can't really avoid it, much as we'd all love to. To the extent that we consider ourselves Buddhists, therefore, how can we make dealing with it, I mean really dealing with it, part of our practice? I want to add at this stage that I know that the topic of climate change can actually lend itself easily to the sort of what you might think of as the worst kind of moralising, sort of browbeating kind of stuff. Let me just get out the way that I don't want to do that or get into the trap of self-righteousness with this. I'm also not claiming to be perfect in my own carbon habits. Then these are just some of my thoughts. I hope they're useful. So why give this talk? Why me? I currently work as a community organiser for an organisation called the Australian Religious Response to Climate Change, and I've worked in the environmental movement in one form or another for something like most of the last 20 years. Most of that hasn't been in climate change directly, it's been in energy conservation, energy efficiency, but that's clearly linked. It has more recently become much more focused on climate change itself. In 2014, I had the really good fortune of spending 3 days in training how to give Al Gore's famous slideshow presentation. We had an excellent overview from all sorts of people, including a day with Mr. Gore. I'm a bit of a climate geek. I even do stand-up comedy about it, which I think is as niche as it gets. Most of my current work is in helping to stop the proposed massive Adani coal mine in the Galilee Basin in Queensland. In my view, this fight to stop this mine, and it is a fight, is Australia's equivalent of the Standing Rock campaign to stop the Dakota Access Pipeline in 2016. I think it's going to be a pivotal moment for Australia's future as the world's biggest exporter of coal. If this particular mine can be stopped, 8 other massive mines in the region, which usually don't get talked about, will very probably be stopped as well, because there's a rail line that will Adani's looking to build, and if that doesn't get built, the other mines don't get to go ahead. The owners of those mines have even said so. And it will send a decisive message to politicians and the coal industry that this really is an end of an era for coal. If the campaign loses, it sends the opposite message, that the industry is impervious to the concerted efforts of pretty much the entire environmental movement. So a lot's at stake. And there are other similar situations happening around the world right now. Okay, but why am I talking about this here in the Buddhist centre? To answer that question, I'm going to ask 3 things. First of all, what is Buddhism saying generally? I don't mean about climate change, I mean what does the Buddhist tradition say about life? That's not easy to sum up, and it's probably foolhardy to try, but I will give it a go. Secondly, what is the situation with climate change? And then, what might be the right understanding of the relationship between these 2 things? Where do they cross over? Where do they part company? And what are the practical implications? So first of all, a bit of an attempt to look at what the Buddhist tradition is trying to communicate. This is going to be really the sparest of outlines, and I don't have that much time. There's a real danger I could give you the wrong end of the stick, but here goes. The first thing to say is that the biggest danger whenever you talk about what Buddhism is trying to communicate, I think, what the Buddha was trying to communicate is that we might think we've understood simply because we've grasped a few key concepts, and that really what the Buddha was trying to communicate is beyond. It doesn't exclude concepts. It's out the other end of concepts. So first of all, I'll start with something less conceptual, a couple of poems. Maybe this will be the most useful part of the talk. So this is by a poet called Ryokan, and I'll read another one by a piece of it by Walt Whitman, who I know isn't Buddhist, but I think what he has to say is saying very much the same thing. So Ryokan was an 18th century Zen monk and hermit and poet. He writes this: "In stubborn stupidity I live on alone, befriended by trees and herbs. Too lazy to learn right from wrong, I laugh at myself, ignoring others. Lifting my bony shanks, I cross the stream, a sack in my hand, blessed by spring weather. Living thus, I want for nothing, at peace with all the world. Your finger points to the moon, but the finger is blind until the moon appears. What connection has moon and finger? Are they separate objects or bound? This is a question for beginners, wrapped in seas of ignorance. Yet one who looks beyond metaphor knows there is no finger, there is no moon." And I think Whitman is pointing at the same thing when he said some decades later, "All goes onward and outward, nothing collapses. And to die is different from what anyone supposed, and luckier. Has anyone supposed it is lucky to be born? I hasten to inform him or her it is just as lucky to die, and I know it. I pass death with the dying and birth with a new washed babe, and am not contained between my hat and boots." So, could spend a whole night and probably quite a lot longer going into those 2 and why I think they're pointing at the same thing. But I'm not going to. I'm just going to leave those poems to speak for themselves. But on a more conceptual level, I guess, what is Buddhism saying? Well, it starts with the idea, or the reality really, of suffering. There's a degree of suffering in everyone's life. Even if it's not gross suffering in your life, there's a background sense of, I'm not sure this is quite it. It's a nagging kind of existential dissatisfaction. It's kind of somehow in the background. To that extent, I guess our predicament as human beings includes, to some extent, our predicament as human beings includes that. And it also includes a lot more suffering than that, usually being, I think they say there's 3 kinds of suffering. There's the gross suffering, like physical pain or something like that. There's the one I just described in terms of existential suffering, and there's another one which is, being parted from what you love, or having what you can't stand right in your life. That's another form of suffering. And then Buddhism goes on to talk about what are the causes of suffering. And it starts, you start trying to address that by looking at the fundamental Buddhist philosophical position of what you call conditionality, or conditioned co-production. That all phenomena arise in dependence on conditions, and in the absence of those conditions they cease to be. Now that sounds very abstract, but it has very big implications. One of them is that there's nothing about what you think of as yourself that is fixed. What you think of as yourself is really a whole set of conditions. It's not that you don't exist, of course you do, but there's nothing about you that's permanent or fixed. I guess to use the old story, has anyone heard the story of my grandfather's axe? The idea of, I inherited my grandfather's axe, my grandfather changed the handle and my father changed the head, but I inherited my grandfather's axe. In Buddhism it would say, no, you didn't. You got the idea of your grandfather's axe, but actually the whole thing's different now. Similarly, every part of you through your life changes as you go along. In many ways you're different from the person that you were when you were 5, for example. It's not that there's no continuity, but that you couldn't talk about a fixed self that exists through time. It's sort of like the bit in the middle. Buddhism sort of goes, well, no, there isn't one. Which can be a bit disconcerting, so do a lot of loving kindness meditation practice when you take that one in. And in particular, it says, well, when you try to hang on to a very fixed sense of that self, that's where suffering comes from. So I started with suffering, and saying, well, what are the causes of suffering? Well, this is it. And in particular, the Buddhist tradition talks about what you might call, what's called samsara, the wheel of reactive cyclic existence, getting caught in a constant set of sort of morass of reactivity. That's what's going on, and usually just more or less trying to build up or defend an ego identity in one form or another. And that gets represented in images like the wheel of life. The Buddhist tradition goes on to say that we have the potential, however, for complete liberation from all that. And that there are practices that lead to that liberation, and there's usually formulations of the path that leads to that, the most basic one being ethics, meditation and insight, the threefold path. And sometimes we talk here about the 5 great stages of the path. There's 5 sets, 5 groups of practices that Buddhist practice can be thought of in terms of, those are sort of integration, more and more wholeness. Positive emotion, although that's a poor term really, I think kusala karma is the term being translated, which means skillful actions of body, speech and mind. The term spiritual death, which I don't really like, it always sounds like a heavy metal band name to me. But it means letting go of your ego identity. And then spiritual rebirth, which I find equally problematic for other reasons, which really means, what is kind of ultimate in you responding to what is ultimate in the universe. And then there's spontaneous compassionate activity. So yes, that's my attempt at an outline of the Buddhist path, for what it's worth. Okay, so there's that. So the next question is, so what's the climate change situation? Before we can look at what they've got in common. First of all, it's pretty bad. That's the short version. At the moment, scientists measure these things in terms of how much the world is warmed up in terms of global average temperatures above what happened in about 1860, which is before, when the industrial world really started, when carbon emissions really started kicking in any scale. At the moment, the world's slightly over 1 degree above pre-industrial level. And it's already having a number of consequences. you only have to look at the Great Barrier Reef to see if most of what's going on there is the temperature increase of the ocean. We're already seeing increases in fires and floods and extreme storms. By the way, anyone who wants to correct my understanding of climate stuff, please do. But I'm open to that. I'm giving a very proceed version here. The key thing about climate change isn't whether or not we're going to make a transition towards something like renewable energy. Of course we will. That's going to happen. The question is, will we do it fast enough? That's pretty much the only question. I see Colin shaking his head. I don't blame you. There's a lot of people who work in the environmental movement who kind of really deep down think, no, we're not going to. I'm not sure. My jury's out. I'm giving it everything I've got. I'm sure you are. We've got a budget, what they call the carbon budget, which means the amount of carbon dioxide the world can ever afford to emit before we go past certain thresholds. Before we go past a 1.5 degree threshold, and before we go past a 2 degree threshold above pre-industrial levels. To have a 2/3 chance of staying under 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, we can emit about another 700 billion tonnes, which sounds like an awful lot. And it's about half that to avoid going past 1.5 degrees. Trust me, it gets real bad after about 2 degrees and pretty bad after 1.5. At the moment, the world's putting out 50 billion tonnes of CO2 or equivalent, because there's 6 greenhouse gases and they count them in terms of CO2, which is the main one. We're putting out about 50 billion tonnes a year. So it's not a lot of years before we blow that budget. In 2014, 15 and 16, well, before those years, the amount we were putting out as a planet went up and up every year. It hit those 3 years in a row, and it stayed flat. And for those of us who are watching it closely, we all held our breath and thought, oh wow, maybe it's going to come down. And 2017 came along and it went up slightly. So it's not an easy time right now. What that means is that we can get out of this, but essentially all of the scenarios that any of the experts have mapped involve emissions coming down sharply and immediately. That's what needs to happen. There are some reasons for hope. Oh, the other thing is that the other implication of that is pretty much all of the coal, oil and gas, especially the coal in the world, the stuff that we know about, the stuff we're even trading futures options on right now, needs to stay in the ground. The reasons for hope, the biggest reason is probably the plummeting cost of renewable energy. There's 80 or 100 countries right now where it's cheaper to buy a megawatt of electricity or a kilowatt of electricity by putting up solar on your roof or by building a solar farm or something like that than it is to buy off the grid. That's a very big game changer. A huge amount of finance has already shifted out of coal. You're not going to see new coal-fired power stations, pretty much. The problem is we're running existing ones, and if we just let those ones time themselves out, that's all it's going to take. And in the meantime, there's a very determined and growing groundswell of people. That also gives me a great deal of hope. So, what might be the right understanding of the relationship between these two things? First of all, the aim of Buddhist practice is to completely shift our perspective on the existential situation. It isn't particularly to change the world per se, but to change our relationship with it, to change our way of perceiving it. And this shift in perspective really does alleviate suffering at the deepest level. And to help others to do so, I believe, is the most radical form of compassion imaginable. So perhaps one might say that we as Buddhists shouldn't get too preoccupied with changing the world. And perhaps doing so, you might think, might be a bit of a mistake if you're very much a purist about it, or if you take that view. I don't, you might think, you might know that. It might distract us from, to a point that's true, of course. We don't want to get busy just kind of trying to fix problems on a relative level. We do actually want to get down to the roots of the giant weed of suffering. However, something else is true, that getting at those roots necessarily involves many actions of kindness, of compassion. And that's because being kind and being compassionate is the single most effective way of attenuating and undermining our deep-rooted egotism. And that's exactly what that shift in perspective that we're looking for consists in. So to put it very, very mildly indeed, and I would usually put it a lot stronger than this, it's not a distraction. But why make one's particular practice about the climate? I mean, does that mean that all Buddhists should choose to make the kinds of climate that relate to climate, kinds of kindness that relate to climate change their practice? After all, we're doing our best to act kindly in a number of other ways, and surely it's acting from kindness in one form or another that counts, right? The answer to that really depends on whether you're happy to face the possibility of a scenario where there are a certain number of people who are going to presumably make spiritual progress while the rest of the world goes to hell in a handbasket. First of all, such a view would lack any kind of insight into interconnectedness, in my view, as it's not really possible to be happy while others suffer. I mean, that's basic Buddhism. You might also say, well, isn't spreading the Dharma enough if you're a Buddhist? You know, you might say, well, surely there's enough, if enough people practice the Dharma, we wouldn't have been in this situation. We live a simple life. That's what we try to do. We try to recognize interconnectedness, after all. So maybe what we need to do is simply spread and communicate the Buddha's message, and it will all go away. I'd love it if that was the case. I really would. That's all I would do. But that doesn't work either, because the problem with climate change is, above all, is one of time. We literally have about 10 years to turn things around, or we're going to face really awful long-term consequences. There's not enough time to kind of bring about this kind of deep shift in consciousness on a mass scale, unfortunately. Of course, you could say that some people could get on with fixing the climate problem, while others could bring about this shift in perspective that the Buddha was trying to get us to experience, and not everyone has to be a climate activist, perhaps. I'd say not so fast. It's not that easy either, because A, it's one of the most complex issues the world has ever been up against, and by their nature, complex problems require in-depth cooperation between massive numbers of people, pretty much in this case everyone. And B, we're supposed to be setting some kind of example, aren't we? That's what I try to do. And sort of opting out of it doesn't seem to fit that. So there's a sort of responsibility, I think, that comes with being a practicing Buddhist, to say nothing of the more basic responsibility of simply being a human being alive at this moment in time. Occasionally I hear it put more crudely still that climate change is just a distraction from spiritual life because climate change is not fundamentally concerned with enlightenment. But thankfully this view is not very widely held. The vast majority of Buddhists I know are very concerned and just want to know what they can do to help. But in case you know anyone like that, or anyone listening to the recorded version of this later on, does think that, I'd just like to ask you to think, if you're really in favour of not taking action on something that urgently threatens all life because of your spiritual ideals, to me that sounds like a very disturbing view. Okay. And yet there's a certain kind of existential context that's worth bearing in mind. I'm going to refer to a talk by Sangharakshita, our teacher, that he wrote in 1984 on a very different topic, the threat of nuclear war, just as cheerful. And he talked about the urgent need to address an existential threat. By the way, that threat still exists, for those of you who've been watching the news. However, whereas nuclear war is something that might happen if conditions were to change for the worse, the collapse of civilization as we know it and a whole lot of climate catastrophes are something that will happen unless we change conditions. We're already on the collision course. So it's really worth reading this talk or listening to this talk by Sangharakshita. It's called Buddhism, World Peace and Nuclear War. And I think you can pretty much read it, this is me taking liberties obviously, but I think you can pretty much read it and just imagine taking out the words nuclear war and replacing them with catastrophic climate change, and I think it reads like an absolute blueprint for how I think how Buddhists need to act. So this is one thing that he says. I'm going to do that. I'm just going to replace the word nuclear war for this paragraph. He's talking about bringing pressure to governments for change. There are a number of ways in which we can bring pressure on a government to take steps towards avoiding catastrophic climate change. But which ones we adopt will depend on the kind of government with which we're dealing, as well as the political and cultural history of the country concerned, and even on the psychological makeup of its people. Where parliamentary democracy prevails and governments are elected by popular vote, it will be possible to bring pressure to bear simply by refusing to vote for any party or any candidate not unambiguously committed to working for addressing this problem in its totality. Pressure can also be brought to bear by the persistent lobbying of members of parliament, by the presentation of petitions, by public meetings, marches and demonstrations, by fasts and solemn vigils, even by love-ins and be-ins. It was the time of just after the 70s after all. By these and similar means, the government should be left in no doubt as to what the wishes of the electorate really are. If it remains unresponsive to those wishes or not sufficiently responsive, and the situation is of one of extreme urgency where every day is precious, then more serious measures should be taken and pressure brought to bear on the government by means of mass civil disobedience along Gandhian lines. Pretty to the point. He also makes a couple of other really interesting additional points in this talk, and he says, first of all, it's not enough to address one global existential threat. We need to address all of them. Having brought about, in this case, the abolition of nuclear weapons, he says we should work to abolish other weapons that cause global destruction. Likewise, once we address the climate issue, and I hope we do, let's not forget disarmament, starting with nuclear disarmament, unless we really believe that President Trump's meeting with Kim Jong-un is somehow going to save us from that danger. I am not that confident. Secondly, he says, having seen our way clear of the threat of global existential destruction, we still need to know what sense and meaning to make of our lives. What an enormous pity if our sole vision of life after fixing the climate crisis is sitting down with a beer and watching MasterChef. We're still left with the irreducible experience of the fact that life is short and that we need some kind of meaning, even a way of transcending this basic human predicament altogether. Then there is the concern which a friend of mine in the order raised when I saw him a year and a half ago in the UK. He had a concern that when we talk about things like climate change, in our community there's a lack of I guess there could be a lack of a transcendent truth to inspire us and a path leading to that transcendence. There's a danger of kind of, he said, flattening things out into a sort of souped up humanism, kind of flattening Buddhist practice down. And the danger of getting caught up in that and not really being sufficiently motivated by a spiritual ideal. I don't think we need to fall into that trap. I do think it's possible, though. The way around it, I think, is by recognising that positive emotion isn't just developing compassion, but also reverence and devotion. That there's a vertical version of positive emotion as well as a horizontal one. This brings up a problem, however, how to act in ways that consciously serve that ideal, rather than just fixing a human problem, essential and utterly essential though that is. So how to act in a way which addresses both, walks the path to enlightenment while fixing this problem. It's probably easiest to start by saying how not to do it. One of the problems with getting involved in anything political is what's called prapancha, which means proliferation of mental states. If you just close your eyes for a second and I just said the words Tony Abbott, you'd see a proliferation of mental states going off right there, probably. At least I do. And then there's another mental state problem which can come up, which is to do with what's called horrified, overwhelmed, anxiety. This is certainly an occupational occupational hazard for anyone working in the climate movement. And the antidote to that is developing compassion. So there's the metta bhavana, there's three other sub-variations of the metta bhavana, one of which is called the karuna bhavana, which means development of compassion. They say that the enemy, the far enemy of compassion is hatred. The near enemy that looks like it but isn't. There's a couple of them. One of them is horrified, overwhelmed anxiety. And I think a lot of the time people I know in the climate movement who think they're acting out of compassion are acting out of a mix of that and horrified, and overwhelmed anxiety. How also to proceed from some basis of humility? Now, politics doesn't just bring about mental proliferation, it brings out flat-out egotism. In many ways, those are the same thing, of course, but it's a real danger for anyone trying to do something about a big, real, important global problem when we think this turns us into a big, real, important, and possibly even globally significant person. Having said that, it's probably at least as egotistical to refrain from getting involved in doing anything at all about this problem because we don't think we want to run the risk of getting our states of mind ruffled. I think that's probably worse in terms of egotism. But there is an extremely strong emphasis in the Buddhist tradition on taking responsibility for your states of mind. There's a story from the early Buddhist tradition called the Parable of the Saw, where the Buddha is quoted as saying this about anger. Monks, even if bandits were to savagely sever you limb by limb with a double-handed saw, even then, whoever of you harbours ill will at heart would not be upholding my teaching. I've heard one version of that saying, you would be no disciple of mine. This is a long way from what I hear in my fellow activist circles of what people sometimes talk about as justified anger. And it brings up a kind of thorny problem as to the nature of anger. Certainly there's energy in anger. And I guess what one can do if you feel angry about a problem like this is to make use of that energy, but to try and transform it. To try and make use of the determination and the energy, but to drop the tendency to see others as the enemy. I'd like to posit something else as well, and I realise I'm trying to zoom through this. I will do my best. I'm nearly there. I'm trying to posit what a Buddhist approach to politics at all might be. Grand topic, I know. If the fundamental truth of Buddhism is conditionality, that all things arise in dependence on a deeply interconnected web of conditions, and if the Buddhist vision is that of people realising their highest potential, i.e. enlightenment, then I think Buddhist politics should involve creating the conditions in the world that best help people to realise their potential. For those people who want to practice Buddhism, this means conditions that support realising their potential for enlightenment. For those people who don't, it means at least conditions that support other forms of potential in terms of education, the arts, science, amongst other things. This means, in my view, making sure that no one is without the basics when it comes to food and shelter and medicine. It means making education free. It certainly means doing what one can to foster good mental health. I think it means as much personal liberty as possible too within these parameters. Mostly it means a perspective that is about all beings and not just about oneself. And it means looking after the conditions that support life and that enable a stable civilization. It's very hard to realise your higher potential when society is breaking down and the planetary life support systems are collapsing. After all, we take creating the right conditions as Buddhists seriously all the time. There's a reason why we hold meditation retreats in somewhere quiet and beautiful and not in the middle of a motorway. We kind of need the right conditions, right? I'm just applying the same principle to societal level. I hope by now you can see that what I'm advocating for is what I heard Subhuti, a senior member of our order, once referred to as more and more outer action and more inner awareness. These two things are not separate. But by developing more and more inner awareness and more by doing the metta bhavana, for example, or by doing the mindfulness of breathing, you're more capable of responding to the world positively. By creating a world around you, you're fostering the conditions where you and others can do that. These two things are not separate. So the idea of taking climate change onto the path comes down to two things. First, I think, and I'm only one audit member, not everyone's going to say this, we need to make addressing this issue a serious priority. I know most other audit members certainly think that. This needs to become part of our practice in terms of body, speech and mind. And we need to organise and do those things that will make the most difference. Second, in doing this, I believe we need to wholeheartedly take the ups and downs that this will inevitably bring, including the many ways in which our egocentric tendencies will come into play, onto the path. Let's welcome these rather than be afraid of them. Let's see them as a precious opportunity to notice and see into our own deluded egotism. Let's make that our practice. In this sense, practicing the Dharma really can be a refuge from the suffering caused by climate change, at least on one level. If we see into our reactive and egotistical minds, we can become free of that suffering, if not the physical suffering that climate events themselves. And hopefully, by being a little less caught up in ourselves, we will be better able to help others to do the same and to address the pressing climate problem. This does raise one other important consideration. We don't know how this is going to turn out. We do know that we probably will know that in about 10 years. But we don't know now. It could go either way. And I'd like to suggest that whatever happens, we're going to need individuals and communities that practice kindness. We're certainly going to need a sangha of people who practice letting go of the whole ridiculous mass of ego and of all the suffering that brings. Whatever happens, in other words, we will need the Dharma. This doesn't mean that we shouldn't do everything we can to address the climate problem in the meantime. We absolutely should. It just means that as Buddhists, we need to do this, as I hope I've made clear, in the context of our deepening commitment to the path. So, I'm going to finish with some practical suggestions. And this is just a list, and it's like a menu. Take them as you wish. First of all, stopping new fossil fuel developments. That's pretty much the main one. Here in Australia, that means stopping the Adani coal mine. Writing to your MP, maybe surveying other people in your life, like surveying this community. I'd love to see a survey of people who come to this community to ask for their views on it, and then taking that survey to an MP, saying, I'm part of a community where 87% of people or whatever think this. Keeping in touch with me, if you wish to, in the lead up to the federal election, because there's going to be a lot going on. And this, stopping new coal, oil and gas, wherever this may be, it doesn't matter if it's fracking in Leicestershire, or the Midwest of the USA, or the Northern Territory of Australia, where there's a lot of fracking proposed, or oil off the coast of New Zealand or in the tar sands of Canada. Second, divestment, getting your money out of anything to do with coal, oil and gas. Who's your bank account with? Who's your superannuation with? But all four of the big four banks in Australia lend a lot of money to the coal industry. Bank Australia doesn't. I believe mostly the Bendigo Bank doesn't. That's what needs to happen. Similarly, there's a couple of superannuation funds that are doing the same thing. Most of them do lend to those industries. Third, we have this wonderful pledge tree behind Dantachiti here. It's like making a pledge, things that you can do. Some of them are big and some of them are small. Have a look at it. Noticing the tendency towards anger and fear that comes up. Self and other. The mind proliferating. Coming back to an awareness of the body and feelings and practicing mindfulness. Practicing the loving kindness meditation and the Karuna Bhavana, the compassion meditation. And including in them those people you know not only hold different views but who are even actively creating this problem. Reflecting on the conditions, this is a conditionality reflection, that have created the stable world we now live in, the peace that we currently enjoy, and just how fragile those conditions are, but the fact that we have them. Talking with others in the Sangha about these practices. Helping the Sangha to grow, and deepening your practice of the Dharma so that others may have a real refuge from at least one kind of suffering. Offering your efforts to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and the practice known as transference of merits. saying whatever merit I may have accumulated by doing these things, may it go to others.